Okay, great. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us on this very big week, budget week. My name is Kylie Adair. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm joining today from Tiohtià:ke, which is colonially known as Montreal, in the territory of the Ganyangaha people. I've actually just moved here, and I feel really, really lucky to call this place home. And also, having just moved here, have a lot of learning to do about the Indigenous stewardship of this land and the present day relationship this land has to its original stewards. I'm really excited to do that learning. I also know there's really big news today out of the Vatican denouncing the doctrine of discovery, an important big step, but there's so much more work to do on an everyday level by people like me. And on a policy level, some of which we're actually about to dive into right now. So yes, today we're here to talk about the federal budget. The Future of Good editorial team has been hard at work since the budget dropped on Tuesday, unpacking and analyzing. It's 250 pages for our readers. And if you haven't had a chance to read our coverage, I'm just going to drop two links to our stories in the chat right now, which you can open up and sort of follow along as we unpack some of this coverage. And then just one more housekeeping note before we really dive in. If you have any questions as we go about the budget, about our coverage, about Future of Good, please do add them to the chat. We've set aside some time at the end to dive into your questions, or we may sort of pull them up as we go. So yes, and please also introduce yourself to your fellow Future of Good members in the chat. This is an event that's only open to Future of Good members, so you're really among a fantastic community of people who are interested in the same things as you, and we're so excited to have you here and supporting Future of Good. So yeah, well, let's get started. I'm joined today by 6 members of the Future of Good reporting team, so I'll just let them introduce themselves, tell us who you are, where you're joining from, and what you cover here at Future of Good. So Tamid, as the newest member of the team, maybe I'll call on you first.
Sure. Morning, everybody. Thank you so much for coming out. My name is Tamid. I'm the editorial fellow reporting on community resilience and transitions, which basically amounts to a lot of the stuff happening inside communities that's not considered necessarily hard news for a lot of our files. Grassroots movements, activist methods, all kinds of things like that. I'm one of the reporters joining from Treaty 13 territory, what is now called Toronto, traditionally the home to many Indigenous people, including the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Seneca people. And as Kylie mentioned, I, like many journalists, saw the news of the repudiation of the doctrine of discovery yesterday, something that I think a lot of news people had been following for a while because we knew it would be a very big story when it happened. And I hope that all of us who sort of work in this industry can keep in mind that as Indigenous people have been saying for decades, it's a significant symbolic victory, but symbolism only goes so far towards reconciliation. And with that, I'll hand it off to Ramona because she's next to my screen.
Thanks, Samir. Hi, everyone. It's nice to meet you and nice to see some of you again. I'm Ramona. I go by she, her. I'm a reporter on anti-racism and inclusion here at Future of Good. I am also from Treaty 13, which is colonially known as Toronto. And yeah, it's been really interesting to be here and report on diversity, equity, inclusion within the social impact sector, but also the work that the sector does in advancing anti-racism and inclusion for folks or communities who so need that support. And yeah, I'm excited to talk about this year's budget, what we've seen, what we didn't see. And I will pass it on to Charlene because she is also right next to my screen.
Fantastic. Thank you, Ramona. Thank you all for joining us today. It's so nice to see some familiar names and faces. I am Charlene. I use she and her pronouns. I'd like to start by acknowledging that I'm also joining from Treaty 13 territory, and I'm a newcomer to this land, so really excited to continue learning about how we can steward together. I am the editorial fellow on digital transformations, as many of you will already know, which essentially means that I look into the ways the sector is adopting technology, data and digital tools. It's been an absolutely fascinating space to report on, both post-pandemic and 3 years down the line, where we're seeing some fascinating discussions about data ownership, data sovereignty, and all sorts of other things, which we'll be diving into today. Shannon, maybe I'll pass on to you next.
Sure. Thank you very much, Charlene. My name is Shannon Van Reyes. I use the pronouns she and her, and I'm coming from Winnipeg, which is in Treaty 1 territory, so the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene people, and it's also the national homeland of the Red River Métis. At Future of Good, I'm the news and features reporter, so I cover a wide breadth of issues and topics that sort of maybe don't fit in neatly into other categories, but it's a lot of interesting things that come up, and I hope to share some of those interesting tidbits about the budget with you later. But for now, I will pass it on to Gabe.
Hi folks, my name is Gabe Oatley. I use they and he pronouns, and happy Trans Visibility Day to everyone. I am joining from Toronto, Dish with One Spoon, Wampum Belt, Covenant Treaty Territory, and I cover philanthropy and transforming funding models for Future of Good. Pass it off to Bren.
Thank you, Gabe. So my name is Brendan Doherty. I use he, him, and I am joining also from Treaty 13, the traditional territories of the Erie, the Neutral, the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and the Mississaugas, although I am a little further west. I am currently in the city now known as Hamilton. So I cover workforce, I cover the nonprofit workforce and volunteerism in the sector. I've only just started this beat, but I'm trying to cover a wide variety of issues ranging from issues in volunteerism and the lack of volunteers in the sector, to burnout within the sector's paid and unpaid staff, to other kind of bigger issues within anything to do with the sector and the workforce. And I think I will pass it to, have we gone through everyone?
Yeah, you're the last one. I love that it was a round table. We really went around the virtual table.
We did.
Yeah, awesome. Okay, great. I'm going to start with a question for you, Shannon, because you really wrote the sort of first link that I shared in the chat, which is a sort of deep dive into the budget as a whole, like looking at what the big themes were, where the big spends were, and some of the reactions from the sector. So I really would love to hear from you, just as sort of an opening here. How would you sort of characterize this budget based on the reporting that you've done?
Sure. This budget was sort of, to me, a budget of contradictions. In one way, a ton of money was spent. This is actually a very, very large budget. It was 10 billion more than the fall economic outlook predicted in new spending anyways. So, in one way that's good, but very little of it went to the charitable or nonprofit sector. And it's hard in a way to be excited about the presence of absence. So, speaking to people, there's not a lot there to dig your teeth into. One of the things that was noticeably absent, and quite a few people mentioned, was the promised mental health transfer. And that would have been a comprehensive funding model similar to other health transfers to fund specifically mental health. So I think that was a really big disappointment for people in the sector, people in healthcare, and I think many Canadians more generally. And it does seem, kind of ironic that at the same time there was no mental health transfer, we see the $158 million set aside for the suicide prevention line, which, well, I think that's good and necessary. It kind of speaks to an ethos where the government doesn't want to deal with anything till it's in crisis. So if that was the theme, it seems to be throughout. Obviously, environmental concerns got a lot in this budget, and that's something that organizations dealing with climate and the environment were very happy with, particularly those organizations dealing with aquatic species and some of our saltwater issues. So those, that was definitely a highlight. I think more will come out about energy rebates and some of those tax incentives as we go on. Right now, people are very excited about moving to a green economy and green technology. But when you look at some of the fine print, green technology is also nuclear technology. It's also carbon capture, it's hydrogen. It's things that may not be as clear cut. So I think over the next several months, we're going to learn a lot more about how that actually comes together and what that actually means. Another, note of absence, which was really widely reacted to, was international assistance, particularly Canada's feminist international assistance policy. It just really wasn't there in this budget. And I believe it was a 15% reduction overall in international assistance spending, which is about $1.3 billion. And that number is a little tricky because obviously a lot more money is actually going to Ukraine as well. So when you look at the amount spent on, specific feminist assistance issues, I mean, we don't have the entire picture yet, but I would imagine the reduction is far greater than the 15% that we can see now. So those are some of the broad strokes. I think I'd also want to touch on, because everyone was talking about this, was the grocery rebate, which is really, of course, a one-time GST rebate that not everyone will get. And I know Tamid is going to mention a little more on food policies or the lack thereof later. But yeah, a lot of questions have come out of that. No one says they don't want to get a couple $100, but I think for organizations that are really looking at the systemic causes of hunger, that was a real disappointment. And finally, I think that people are hoping for some regulatory changes, and folks I spoke to just didn't see them. I know in last year's budget there was regulatory issues addressed, from disbursement quotas to greater transparency. And that just wasn't in this budget either. And so again, absence was sort of the theme for the charitable sector. Other sectors did better, but yeah, not more of what wasn't there than what was there this time around.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you've also done a lot of coverage over the past few months for us about inflation, the cost of living crisis, and how it is impacting communities and the organizations that work with them. How would you characterize the budget as it relates to addressing inflation? You sort of talk about not really getting to the systemic root issues, but yeah, what was your takeaway there?
I mean, on the surface, this was a budget. It was billed as a budget about affordability. Mm-hmm. And I guess this goes back to it being a budget of contradictions. There are some small affordability measures, and again, the grocery rebate, but there was no measures to really, some people had hoped for taxes on excess profits. And that's something we're seeing with the grocery industry right now in terms of, committee hearings and, hearings in Ottawa. And I think there was a hope that there would be targeted measures to stop companies from unduly. And that just hasn't happened in this budget. Maybe that was a tall ask. Maybe that was never going to happen. But I think that we didn't see, at least I didn't see quite as much, or the people I've spoken to haven't seen quite as much as they would have liked. I mean, inflation is going down now. Some things are, receding. So I'd be curious to know what kind of last minute adjustments happened here. I will never know. No one will ever know. But only time will really tell, I think, what the impact is.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm also just going to take this opportunity to share that we are doing another members event next week, where you and I, Shannon, will dive a lot deeper into this and into inflation in general and how it's impacting community organizations. So I'm just going to add a link to that in the chat. But in the meantime, for Shannon and for the rest of the team, I really would love to hear about what stood out to you in this budget. We all sort of, or many of you here on this call, have your sort of beats where you cover specific issue areas for Future of Good. And so I know you're looking at the budget through that lens. So maybe Charlene, we'll start with you. What really stood out to you in this budget as it relates to digital and data, and what do people need to know from this budget in those areas?
Absolutely. I mean, as Shannon has already alluded to, it's pretty thin on the ground, especially when we think about tech and data as it pertains to social purpose work as well. That's certainly not exempt from the thinness of the budget. But I will point out one thing that really stood out to me and something that I think folks in the sector should definitely keep an eye on. And that is a whopping $505 million investment into better healthcare data. The idea essentially being to allow more patient data to be collected and crucially to be shared between healthcare providers. The idea in the budget is to improve what they call interoperability between healthcare providers so that data sharing can allow for a more seamless experience of patient care. Obviously, it's a huge financial and monetary commitment, and I'd be interested in seeing how healthcare providers at a provincial and city level are committed to sharing this data between them to allow for that seamless experience. But perhaps more crucially for our audience and the group of people here, I think it's really fascinating to see how this huge amount might trickle down to community organizations working in health and well-being as well. Are they also going to be a part of this effort to share data? Will they have access to patient data? Will they be able to share their experience of working with community organizations on the ground as well? And there's obviously a lot of hesitation when it comes to sharing personal and identifiable information, and health data is particularly sensitive. So I think crucially, there's still an open question there about how all of this will be shared in a safe and secure and transparent way. And I would hope that some of that 505 million is dedicated to making sure that it's done securely and safely and transparently.
Yeah.
Ramona, perhaps I'll pass to you.
I think you said my name correct.
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, I think one of the takeaways that I saw in this year's budget was the fact that we're expecting to see a new action plan to combat hate in Canada. I believe the federal government proposed around $50 million over the span of 5 years. And what the money will go to Public Safety Canada, which will use that money to expand their Communities at Risk Security Infrastructure program. And it's interesting because that program is meant to like fund institutions who are often targets of hate crime and violence just due to their identity. And these institutions range from places of worship, educational institutions like schools, community centers. So it's interesting to see that now, especially in a time where we have seen a spike in hate crimes being reported, especially during the early years of the pandemic onwards. Yeah, it's been interesting to take a look at that, and hopefully we'll see more of that in next year's budget. I'm going to pass it on to Gabe. What did you notice there?
Yeah, thanks, Ramona. So yeah, with my coverage focusing on philanthropy, I was looking for some of the updates to some of the regulatory changes that the government has already announced. So the government has announced that they will make changes to the data that all charities in the sector have to provide through their T3010 form. So I wondered if the government would provide more of an update on that in this budget. They didn't. The government has also promised back in budget 2018, the Social Finance Fund, a $755 million fund to boost social finance in the sector. There was no update. There has been no announcement yet about the organizations that will be leading the fund. But in a way, I think it's maybe not surprising. Like, the government is doing a lot behind the scenes. Not everything has to be announced in this budget. We did an interview with the head of the Charities Directorate a couple of weeks back, and she said that T3010 form change is indeed underway. That will be coming in to place fall 2023. The disbursement quota boost has already happened. The Social Finance Fund, we have every indication that it will be announced. Like, folks in the sector are saying that the partners have indeed already been selected, and that is coming. I think it's just when the hell is it coming? And I think, some of the biggest asks on the part of the sector that the government would establish a home in government for the sector, that the government would provide long-term core funding for organizations in the sector. I think those are big asks. I think those have been long-term asks that have not yet come to fruition. And with a budget where the government was really trying to thread the needle and focus on a couple of big core issues, climate change, reconciliation, inflation. To be honest, I can't say that I feel that surprised that some of those items, those big items, I'd say that the sector was calling for, didn't show up. I'll throw next to Mead.
Sure. So I think as Shannon said, I also feel like this is a budget that made a big show of combating food insecurity and the rising cost of groceries. But whereas there was, that rebate, what we didn't see as much of in the budget was funding for targeted community level programs. And to me, it does seem like that is a missed opportunity to support a lot of the organizations that are working within like their regional areas to try and make sure that people have enough to eat. What we did see was a sort of billed as like a new amount was a $10 million top up to something called the Local Food Infrastructure Fund. And that's a program in the North to help build sustainable, nutritious local food networks. But actually this money was already announced last year as part of a 2-year top up. And the program is supposed to end next year, but there was no indication that the program would be extended. So if your organization is working on food insecurity, I'm curious to know like how you feel that top up does or doesn't address your needs. Another thing that stood out to me was the legal aid funding for asylum seekers. So this budget, like last year's, did make a $43.5 million commitment to legal aid for asylum seekers, same amount as last year. And an additional $10 million so that citizen applications can now use biometric identification to sort of speed things along. But I'm sure you must have all seen the tragic news that came out yesterday about the families of 2 migrant families that were found in the St. Lawrence River. I think it's probably too early to know if these were people attempting to cross the river because of the Roxham Road crossing, but it's not improbable. The point at which they were crossing, or sorry, rather, which their bodies were found is only about an hour and a half's drive from Roxham Road. And there's been enough criticism from humanitarian organizations that I think we can look to a lack of legal aid funding or a lack of support for asylum seekers as a weakness of this budget. And what we saw last year was that there was actually $1.4 billion for the upkeep and maintenance of shelters for asylum seekers, and also just to improve some of the paperwork that comes with seeking asylum. That ticket item is not mentioned in this budget, which isn't like necessarily an indication that it has been cut. It's no longer a priority. It may have simply been that the dollar amount has not changed and it will still be parceled out as expected. But it is disappointing to not see it at least be a priority. And I think, at least for a journalist like me, it not being in the budget sort of makes me wonder, well, what exactly happened to that 1.4 billion? And if that money is not going to be spent on asylum shelters at a time when that's getting so much attention, why was that not announced transparently? Brennan, do you want to go next?
Sure. I guess I'll just start by saying that when it comes to nonprofit work and labor stuff, the federal budget is kind of an interesting one. For those of you who don't know, the jurisdiction in Canada over workplace issues tends to be split between the provinces and the feds. And in fact, the vast majority of workplaces, including the vast majority of nonprofit workplaces, would fall under provincial legislation. That's not to say the feds can't do anything. But it is likely that the federal government looked at this and said, this isn't really our problem. That said, one thing that did stand out to me is there is a very dully named program called the Labor Market Transfer Agreement. It's basically every year, the federal government gives about $3 billion to provinces and territories to help folks on EI, folks who are trying to train for a new job or get back into the workplace, to help them do that, to give them programs to, whether that's a wage subsidy, whether that is help with career counseling and what have you. This year they bumped that, they added an additional $625 million on top of it. Now, it's not earmarked specifically for the sector, but I know the sector in particular is having a lot of problems. There is a huge burnout crisis within the sector, especially among frontline workers. And I wonder if this program, while not explicitly intended for the sector, could perhaps lead to more people getting exposed to the idea of working in the sector and taking a job in it and doing their part. I wasn't surprised that there were a lot of things left out, but I will say that one thing that I did find interesting, and in fact, I was told this by the national president of the Canadian Union of Public Employees, which represents a lot of folks working in nonprofit, that they were really surprised to see a lack of affordable housing initiatives. There was about a $4 billion item for an Indigenous and Northern housing strategy. I think I got that name right, which is welcome news. I mean, that's certainly good, but you know, that plan has been in the works for a while, and there's no immediate spend on that. Like, it's not clear when that's going to be unveiled. Whereas, you know, at the end of the day, housing is perhaps the biggest expense any worker has. And so, as much as a worker housing policy may not seem like something that's important to nonprofit workers, I think it is. I will also add to that I know that Volunteer Canada was pretty disappointed by this budget. Specifically, there's not a lot of, I don't think the word volunteer, if it is mentioned, it's very sparingly. And that is something the federal government would be in a better position to put policy in towards, and we just haven't really seen any movement on that. Yeah, I think I'll leave it at that.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone. We have a question here in the chat from Chelsea, which I think I will direct to you, Gabe. It's about the any investment, I guess, in this budget, or if we, you know, sort of as you referenced, if we know of anything sort of behind the scenes in development to support the pipeline to the Social Finance Fund. For example, the Investment Readiness Fund, other ecosystem initiatives. Anything you noticed there in the budget, or anything else you might want to share on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I mean, the obvious note, and this was not in the budget, but this was an announcement that came before the budget, was the $400 million Community Services Recovery Fund, which was, you know, an extension of a fund that had already announced quite a bit of money, rolled out quite a bit of money for the sector during the pandemic. So I think that, and yeah, the applications were open, you know, in January, and organizations that applied for that funding, as I understand it, will be sort of notified pretty soon whether or not they got support. And that very much is both funding to support, yes, like modernization and transformation of organizations in the sector, but also providing some pretty core support for organizations that are struggling as a result of the pandemic. So I think it's important to not lose sight. Like, that is a big fund. That's a big chunk of money flowing to sector organizations. And I think this budget did include a whack of other subsector specific funds that will really support, you know, individual aspects of the sector. You know, I was even looking at the funding that was focused on combating the opioid crisis, $360 million over 5 years. A chunk of which is going to community-based organizations to support with harm reduction and prevention. So I do think there are, you know, a lot of carve-outs in this budget that support subsectors. And I think there have been other announcements that will benefit the sector that were not, you know, re-announced in this budget, like the $200 million endowment fund to support Black communities. So yeah, those are some of the thoughts that come to mind for me.
Yeah, absolutely. I know we've sort of already gotten into a little bit of what we were sort of surprised not to see, or gaps that we noticed, and gaps that folks in the sector have pointed out to us. But I want to ask that question again, and maybe Ramona, I'll start with you. Just given the criticism we've seen around the lack of targeted support for queer and trans serving organizations, I would love to know, you've covered this work for us in the past, and I'd love to know what you sort of thought of that and other gaps you've noticed in the budget. What were you surprised not to see?
For sure. It's a good, thank you for mentioning that. Based on what I've seen, it seems like there's a lack of any new commitments and additional funding that's specifically targeted for the 2S LGBTQI communities and organizations out there, specifically trans people who are facing this unprecedented spike of violence. It was kind of surprising to not see any money being allocated specifically for this. Last year, we saw in the federal budget a federal action plan for LGBT, I believe it's called the Federal LGBTQ Action Plan, and the government proposed $100 million over a span of 5 years. So for a lot of organizations that are here to advance inclusion for these communities, it was seen as a great starting point. But then for these organizations like the Canadian Center for Gender and Sexual Diversity and Wisdom to Action, when they saw this year's budget, it was everything but hopeful, for lack of better words. It was a disappointment, frankly. And it seemed like for them, and I'm going to paraphrase here, they said something along the lines of a missed opportunity. It's gives them the sentiment that, you know, we're going to end up following the same path as the United States and the United Kingdom. Yeah, it was just a very big disappointment. And it seemed that last year's commitment to creating this action plan was more of a finishing point rather than just a starting point.
Anyone else want to jump in? What's like a huge gap that you noticed or that you're hearing from the sector?
I can quickly jump in there. I think one thing that was really surprising to me to not have seen when we think about tech and data is any update or breakdown of the Universal Broadband Fund, which was a federal program that was launched during the pandemic to ensure that all Canadians have access to high-speed internet regardless of their location. I will caveat that and say that the government did launch an online portal as of about a week ago to show the progress that has been made. But I think in the context of the budget, there wasn't a specific breakdown on what's been used so far of the fund or any additional funding promised, which implies that all that funding has dried up. Another thing that I was really surprised not to see, and that I have heard from folks in the sector already, was a lack of any ring-fenced funding for digital and technical upskilling specifically, particularly for people who don't have access to this sort of education and the opportunities that it would bring because of particular financial barriers or other access barriers. And I think that probably means in the context of community organizations that that work will continue to fall on the shoulders of nonprofits and community organizations who are likely continuing to fill those education gaps. And actually, Steve just messaged me as we've been talking, and pointed out an additional thing that I realized wasn't pointed out at all, was a lack of funding and policymaking around generative AI and responsible development of that technology as well. You know, that has completely been omitted in the budget altogether. So I think that will be a really interesting space to watch going forwards to see if the government will be reactive in a timely manner.
Another opportune moment to share that we are hosting a second webinar on ChatGPT and ethical AI. So I'll share the link a little bit later in the chat for that. Yeah, thanks, Charlene. And we have another audience question here, which maybe I'll put to you, Bren, just given what you shared about sort of jurisdiction. Nicole says, I know today's call is focused on the federal budget, but given the recent Ontario provincial budget announcement, any thoughts on that budget? So yeah, what maybe as it has to do with workforce, labor issues, what's coming up for you there?
Right. So so for those who don't know, the Ontario government came out with a budget at pretty much the same time as we were neck deep in the federal budget. So I'd say to start, the Ontario budget the current Ontario government is really interested in the idea of building a skilled workforce and building, more capacity there. So there's actually a fair bit of funding for retraining and upskilling for employees overall. Now, it doesn't specifically cover the sector, but presumably it could. So we're talking about things like the Skills Development Funds. There's another $75 million for that over the next 3 years. And it's basically to support people who face barriers in employment. It is mainly talked about as a skills trade thing. It's not surprising given the current government and its focus. There's a number of initiatives there. What's also interesting, though, is the Ford government has promised an additional 5% in base funding for mental health organizations specifically. To help them address, of course, the rise in mental health challenges and addiction challenges. And while a lot of that money is probably going to be earmarked for programs, if it's base funding, that suggests to me that, if you're expanding, if you're doubling your capacity for programming, you've got to do it. You've got to add more workers. And so that could represent a real opportunity for organizations to hire more qualified workers to serve communities on that. I'd say as far as workforce as well, there's also this really interesting idea of something called the Ontario Micro-Credentials Challenge Fund, which basically it's a series of short duration programs that help people quickly train in very specific niche skills over short periods of time while still being able to work, which I think could be really helpful for marginalized workers who simply cannot afford to take a year, 2 years, 4 years off from paid work to be able to pursue a degree. And I think for folks who want to get into the sector, who maybe are really interested in serving their communities but don't have the ability to do that, I think that could be a really interesting proposal. So there's probably a lot more we could unpack in that, but I think that's kind of the top line for workers in the nonprofit sector at large.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks, Brendan. Thanks for that quick detour into provincial stuff. But on the federal budget again, and we only have a few minutes before I really want to dive into some audience questions. So please do add some questions in the chat if you have them or thoughts that you'd like us to sort of respond to. But I'm curious, what are we, so, the federal budget comes out, we're all kind of all hands on deck, we're neck deep in the budget stuff, as you said, Brad. But our coverage of this sort of policy doesn't end here, doesn't end this week. So I'm curious, what are you watching for? What are you following? What are you looking for more developments on? What will you be sort of keeping track of going forward as it was announced in this budget? Maybe Shannon, I'll start with you.
Sure. I think that's a big question. I feel like I'm on the spot. I know that the 30 million for Indigenous land governance is something that I'm curious to see how that actually is used in real time. 30 million really isn't that much. And I know there's been so many promises made, so many promises broken. I really wonder how that is going to play out. I know they promised a reserve land and environment management program, but that's going to be run by Indigenous Services Canada, and that in itself has created controversy in the past. So yeah, very curious to see how this money is actually allocated in the end and what the end results are, and what Indigenous organizations have to say about it once it starts, once they hit the ground running and we see where it's going to go.
Yeah, Gabe, I know you heard from someone about, you were working on a story with sort of more reactions from the sector to the budget. I know you heard from someone some criticism of that. Do you want to share anything on that?
Yeah, just the specific criticism I heard was more, there was more in the budget that focused on supporting Indigenous communities via First Nation bands, as opposed to funding Indigenous communities through grassroots organizations, not-for-profits, and charities directly. And just the note that bands are by nature sort of colonial structures that were established to respond to the structures laid out in the Indian Act, and just a feeling that those are not always in all communities sort of the best vehicle to support the, self-driven desires of members of those communities. So yeah, that was the piece I heard. I wonder if I can also just comment on one, like, since I have the mic, maybe I can just share my sort of piece on, yeah, what I'll be looking for next. The piece that I've been thinking about a lot around this budget, so many sector reactions, folks saying, you know, there isn't a lot in here for the sector. I read charity lawyer Mark Bloomberg's reaction to the budget, and one of the things he said was like, you know, for folks expecting more for the sector, maybe this should prompt a little bit of soul searching about to what degree this sector has the ear of the federal government, and to what degree the sector is resourced up enough to win the advocacy demands that the sector wants. I think it's a good and interesting point. It had me looking at federal lobbying records, and the Investigative Journalism Foundation did a great story looking at lobbying over the last decade or so. They noted that lobbying has really kicked up. The Mining Association of Canada, I know this is a bit of a detour, but follow me here. The Mining Association of Canada has lobbied the federal government the most of any organization over the past, 10 odd years. They logged over 2,200 communications with the federal government, and their share of the GDP, the mining industry's share of the GDP, is just 6%. We know that the charity sector's share of the GDP is 8%. And, no shade on Imagine Canada, but Imagine Canada is nowhere near the top 10 list of organizations with federal sort of communications. And so to me, the question that it raises is, to what degree is the charitable sector, and where is wealth held in the charitable sector? It's held in foundations. To what degree are foundations seeing this as enough of a priority issue, such that in budget 2024, some of the sector's demands might show up a little bit more strongly? And I think Shannon did a story 2 weeks ago on Imagine Canada's work to try and pull together organizations sooner to be prepared to get the submissions early in, to try and make a dent in budget 2024. So that's the thing I feel like I'm going to be looking at over the next year, is how our sector organizations, and particularly organizations like Imagine Canada, Ontario Nonprofit Network, others across the country, to what degree are they being resourced to make, to make the sector's demands feel as pressing as I think many folks feel this week, when they're feeling the disappointment of not seeing things show up in the budget.
Go ahead, Bren.
Yeah, just to follow on that fantastic point, that's a question I had. I also read Mark Bloomberg's point there, and I thought it was really interesting just from this perspective of work and labor and volunteerism, because as I mentioned kind of at the top as my big caveat, there are some labor things like CPP and EI that matter to workers regardless of where you are in this country. But a lot of the actual work that's been done on labor generally and employment standards is provincial. And so I find it really interesting that Imagine, and not just Imagine, other organizations have really pushed this idea of like a federal labor strategy for the sector and stuff. And I mean, I've worked for Future of Good on and off since 2020. They've asked for it every year. It has never shown up. And so, not to say that, maybe it is worth trying again, but I find it interesting that there's so much effort federally, and perhaps not as much effort that's going like provincially by provincial and territorial organizations. Again, I know the Ontario Nonprofit Network does this, but they can only influence Ontario. And so I'm curious as to, whether there is a more concerted effort coast to coast to try to make this happen, if this is something the sector is really interested in.
Yeah, absolutely. Tamid, what are you watching for in terms of continuing coverage out of this?
So kind of going back to what Shannon said, one of the differences I noticed between this budget and the last year's is how they approach the issue of Indigenous children's welfare. So what we see is that both budgets have sort of made reference to what the federal government calls Jordan's principle. This idea that sort of jurisprudential differences between the federal government and provinces sometimes create these gaps in healthcare for First Nations. And it's named after Jordan Anderson, a boy who died precisely because of this issue. He was sort of denied healthcare by both the provincial and federal government because they weren't sure who was responsible. What we see in sort of this budget and last budget is a number of First Nations are mentioned specifically, and they're sort of receiving targeted funding to support their jurisdiction over their own sort of children's welfare. Basically, I think it's sort of both an act of reconciliation, of returning over some control, but also to really acknowledge that it's communities that best understand the health needs of the people who live in them. And what they need is like funding and support from governments to make that happen. However, the big difference is that last year there was a line about supporting in general Indigenous communities' involvement in children's welfare, whereas now we sort of see that line taken out, and it's just targeted funding at 2 First Nations. And it's not a smoking gun by any means, but it does sort of, as a reporter, make me kind of wonder where the government sort of priorities are, and if they're wondering maybe it's too expensive right now, and a time where they're trying to reduce government spending to support like a broad swath of Indigenous communities, and maybe it should be more targeted. That does seem to me like to be potentially more of a partial solution if there's not like more involvement in the actual legislative change. So that is probably something I'm keeping an eye on. Just seeing sort of how that legislative involvement from Indigenous communities shakes out over the next couple of years.
Yeah, absolutely. And we have a question also here from an audience member, Kashiv, I hope I pronounced that correctly, that I think I'll direct to you first, Hamid, and then we can have others sort of chime in. Just sort of given your coverage of the housing aspects of the budget. So Kashiv writes, I'm curious how you think about the lack of substantive action on key levers of affordability like housing and its implications on attracting and retaining young folks in the sector. And so I think this is a question for you, Tamid, in terms of the housing policy. It's also for you, Brennan, in terms of attracting folks into the sector. And then Shannon, I know you're doing some reporting on housing insecurity for sector workers. So anyone who wants to sort of start us off there, I think, yeah, let's sort of unpack this.
Let's start with you, Tamid. I'll voluntold you.
Sure. This is a really good question, and I feel on the spot because I have not, I didn't come prepared with thoughts. I think that the issue is like really clear in the question. It's young people who are most affected by the housing crisis, at least if we sort of like look at age. I think if we're talking about an intergenerational like lens to the budget, that's not just about affordable housing, because increasing access to affordable housing hopefully is like a tide that lifts all boats, affects everybody. I think if the federal government wanted to target younger people specifically, you'd have to look at the drivers of their instability and their lack of income relative to previous generations. And a lot of it comes back to like not having adequate support for employee groups to push for sort of better wages in the workplace, not having the kinds of access to like affordable education that previous generations had. Canada has, relative to many of the countries it likes to compare itself to, very affordable education. Relative to Canada's own history, it's now considerably more expensive and harder to get a university or college degree than it was decades ago. And I think like some of those difficult to address systemic changes are really driving intergenerational housing inequities. Brennan, Shannon, any thoughts?
Yeah, so just piggybacking on that, I'm going to sound like a broken record for a lot of this, but I think one way to build intergenerational equity into the sector, and one way to look at this is, I mean, at the end of the day, nonprofit workers are typically paid much less than their for-profit counterparts, much less than their government counterparts, and really good wages, good sustainable wages are the key to building intergenerational equity. Like, we like to compare. I know it's a very North American fantasy, the idea of kind of like, the post-50s idea that, everyone having their own home and car and, white picket fence and stuff. And a lot of that wealth was built on the idea of strong wages, strong benefits being a standard. And that's not the case for the sector largely. I mean, there are organizations that pay well, and all power to them, but until you can build a sector that can sustainably pay people wages that are as competitive as the private sector, or slightly less, like I don't see how you can build that. So I'll throw it to Shannon as well, because she will have much more interesting thoughts on this than me.
I do have a few thoughts, so thank you for that. Yeah, in terms of wages, I've been looking at Vancouver recently, and to shock and horrify everyone, a one-bedroom apartment now averages $2,600. So if you were going to look at the Canadian Housing and Mortgage Corporation's guidelines, which say you spend no more than 32% of your income on housing, you would have to make $100,000 a year to afford a one-bedroom apartment. And while wages are definitely part of the issue, I don't think any business really could be sustainable, let alone a nonprofit, where you're paying people $100,000 a year. So I think that 50% of this problem is wages, but I do think the other half of this is housing. And one solution, which I didn't see anything about in the budget, is cooperatives. In the 70s and 80s and up till 1992, the federal government had a very strong cooperative housing policy, and a lot of money went in to starting up housing co-ops that are still going strong. So Ontario and Quebec have the greatest number of housing co-ops. Most of them are 30, 40 years old, still provide great housing, but very few new ones have been built in recent decades. The one exception to that, of course, is actually BC. So the British Columbian government has put forward more money, more regulatory changes to assist this. So in the last few years, I don't have the exact number on how many have been built, but there's about 15,000 cooperative housing units right now in BC. So I think that in terms of lowering the cost of housing, and something that we could have seen in this budget and didn't, was definitely on the cooperative side. Other measures, we've had a smattering to bring housing prices down, and nothing seems to work. I can think of other tax changes that might have. I mean, targeting foreign ownership, I'm not sure if that's done anything. I'm not the expert on that. But yeah, I do feel like in terms of cooperatives and in terms of just lowering the price of houses, in addition to wages, really was a missed opportunity here.
Yeah, maybe I can piggyback off of that a little bit. I think on the question of affordability, we'd be remiss to not mention the federal government's investment in expanding dental care. That was one of the signature aspects of this budget. And like, we all need to make sure that our fangs don't fall out. Like that is an important aspect of affordability in everybody's life. And so, yeah, this federal government invested $13 billion to expand dental care for families earning less than $90,000 a year. That's a really significant commitment. I think, to Shannon's point, what we didn't see on the less sunny side, we didn't see some of the larger tax measures that organizations like Canadians for Tax Fairness have called for. Specifically, this government did not introduce a wealth tax at a time of dramatic increases in inequality and wealth being concentrated at the top of the income spectrum. We also did not see an excess profits tax. So there was a tax that is being increased on banks. One of the sectors of the economy that has done the best over the 3 years of the pandemic so far. but Canadians for Tax Fairness specifically noted that that was not extended to other industries that have also reaped huge profits during the last 3 years. And of course, why do we care about that money? We care about that money because it funds all of the programs that community members in our sector want to see. I think one last point on your piece there, Shannon, around housing. I was reading the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives coverage, and Ricardo Tranjan, who has written a new book on the financialization of housing, noted that he was really disappointed not to see any efforts to cool down the rental market and tackle the financialization of housing. There was some big new money in the budget to support a strategy focused on housing for urban, northern, and rural Indigenous people. So that is significant. But he noted that there's really nothing there that is going to dramatically cool down the rising cost of housing that we're seeing all across the country.
Go ahead, Tamid.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in on that and say, like, Gabe, what you were pointing out about not changing tax legislation, I think it sort of indicates like how the federal government is approaching the problem of inflation. It's very much sort of like, let's focus on monetary policy, and when it comes to fiscal policy, let's try and reduce government spending in a couple of key areas, but maintain those like hot button political items that we can't avoid. And that is like healthcare, that's dental, that's groceries. But we're not seeing like any sort of like more substantive fiscal policy, just sort of like increases in government revenue from the tax perspective. And I think that is really interesting, because it seems to be what so many provincial and municipal governments are doing as well, in addition to the federal government. For whatever reason, it seems like a lot of the economists in Canadian governments are all on the same page when it comes to how they're tackling inflation, and targeted investment to communities and like targeted wealth redistribution is not a part of their plan.
Yeah, absolutely. We have about 4 minutes left. And I just saw a note that we haven't unpacked the $160 million women's program to advance gender equity. And of course, there are a bunch of numbers that were significant that we haven't been able to get to. So just a reminder to go check out that story that everyone here on screen contributed to and did a really fantastic job putting together. But I want to just throw it to you, Ramona and Charlene, maybe for some last words. What are you taking forward out of this? What are some unanswered questions you have? What are some of the next steps for you?
For sure. I guess I'll go first. I put my mic on first, I guess. Yeah, I've noticed that with the $160 million that was proposed there, it did seem like a celebration for a lot of people in the sector. I know the Women's Legal Education Action Fund and other organizations started this national campaign, I believe last year, or in recent months, mentioning that, this funding that they got from previous years was set to expire this April, and they were asking for, I believe, around 125 million over 5 years. This year they got 160 over 3 years, and while it didn't fulfill like that exact timeline, it was still worth celebrating for them. I think the criticism that came with that, however, was that it seemed that there was kind of this like general paintbrush swept on it, because what was mentioned within the budget is that, yes, they're going to prioritize Indigenous people, gender diverse people, people who are part of the 2S LGBTQI I'm seeing the feedback. I communities. And I feel like when you generalize like that with such a large funding, it can be not as efficient and not as sustainable, which is why we also saw these same groups advocate for additional funding for these particular communities who often face hate and violence and so forth. So that's my takeaway. It was still a celebration for a lot of people in the sector, but they do wish that more could have been added elsewhere.
Wonderful, thanks, Ramona. And sorry to sort of interrupt you with that poll. I just wanted to give folks a few minutes. I just launched a very quick feedback poll. It's only 2 questions. So if you could just let us know what you thought of this event. And in the meantime, Charlene, I'll just give you the last word here.
Yeah, I'll be super, super quick. And actually for a budget, what I want to bring up is something that had no monetary value attached to it, ironically. And that was the Smart Cities Challenge. I'm really interested to see how that develops, and crucially how community organizations, nonprofits and charities might be able to get involved and have their say in the program. So the government has essentially proposed launching another round of the challenge to give prize money to city or regional governments who have a tech or data-based solution to improve community well-being in some respects. So some of the solutions that we saw coming out in 2019, which was when the last round of this took place, were solutions to do with tackling energy poverty, for example. Now, 2019 was a long time ago. So post-COVID and after a lot of the cost of living issues that we've seen, I think it will be fascinating to see what a new round of the challenge could bring. But the commitment is extraordinarily vague. There's no timeline, there's no funding allocated to it. And I think there are some huge open questions that would be interesting to keep an eye on as a sector. I think beyond funding, is there additional support provided for city, regional governments or community organizations to take part in a challenge like this? I think it assumes that folks have a level of tech or data competency to start with, which obviously puts a lot of people on a back foot to accessing that prize money, which, if I've remembered correctly, is 5, 10 or 50 million, depending on the size of your solution that you're proposing. And again, as everybody has alluded to over the last few minutes, I would also be really interested to see what the equity and intersectionality lens is here. How are we making sure that this funding is distributed in a way that is equitable and fair and just? So a very, very vague commitment made, but very interested to see what the sort of more concrete steps are to achieving that over the next couple of months.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that'll be a big part of our coverage for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all so much for sharing your thoughts. I know it's been a very busy week, and I really appreciate you joining and having this really rich discussion. And thank you to everyone who joined in the audience for being Future of Good members, for supporting Future of Good. And I'm going to add those 2 links to the future webinars that we have coming up. So please do check those out. And if you ever lose those links, you can always find upcoming webinars on our website under Talks. So thanks so much, everyone. Have a great day.